Hi, Dan. Glad you could join us today for the Stanford Blockchain Club. We're super happy to have you here, and we'd love to learn more about some of your recent work on, especially your recent paper just published for SBC on traitor tracing for threshold decryption. So I guess my first question to you is, can you just broadly talk about why is this sort of idea necessary in this space? What is kind of like the problem space that motivates this work in the first place?
Yeah, hey Jay, hey Yavor, glad to be here. So happy to talk about this trader tracing paper. This is a paper that just appeared at SBC, the Science of Blockchain Conference 2024, and it's also going to appear at the Crypto Conference this summer. It's already available on ePrint, so anyone can read kind of and go into more details of what we're discussing here. So yeah, let's start at the beginning. So maybe it's good just to set context. Let's start at kind of at the high level into what we call multi-user cryptography, or sometimes this is called threshold cryptography, which is basically a way to protect a secret key by splitting it up into pieces. So for example, if you want to generate a signature on a message, all n pieces or t out of the n pieces need to participate in order to generate a signature. Same thing applies to decryption. The way you would protect a decryption key is you split it up into n pieces. You would give each piece to a different entity, and then maybe all n pieces are needed to decrypt the ciphertext, or maybe just t out of the n pieces are needed to decrypt the ciphertext. Yeah, in one case, I would call sometimes it's called an n out of n system. In the other case, it's called a threshold system. But this applies equally to signatures and to decryption. Yep. So now, I guess what we were interested is in this question of accountability in threshold signatures and accountability in threshold decryption. Yeah, and we'll talk about why that's interesting in just a second, but let me first explain the idea of accountability. So when it comes to threshold signatures, let's start with that because that's a little bit easier to understand. There's really kind of two categories of threshold signatures. Yeah, one is we call it a private threshold signature, where again, T out of N parties will issue a signature, but the signature doesn't reveal what the threshold is and doesn't reveal which T out of the N parties generated the signature. Yeah. So this is needed in applications where, like in custody applications where a signing key is actually split across multiple servers. You don't want to reveal to the world what the threshold is, so the adversary doesn't know how many pieces of the secret key it needs to collect in order to generate signatures. Yeah, so that's private threshold signatures. They have their own applications, typically when it comes just to protecting a key. Accountable threshold signatures are the exact opposite. Yeah, in accountable threshold signatures, what happens is the signature itself, not only does it reveal the threshold, it reveals exactly the set of parties that were used to sign the message. Yeah. And the
Mhm.
reason you want that is if for some reason a signature is posted on chain that was generated improperly, yeah, you want to know which exactly, which three out of the five users generated that signature so you can go and investigate and see what went wrong in those three
Oh, okay.
among those three signers. This also happens in like a proof of stake blockchain where you might have a threshold of, 500,000 signers out of 800,000 signers. And you want to know that if the signature, well, if an incorrect block is signed, you want to know exactly which signers signed the incorrect block so that it can go and be slashed. Yeah.
Okay. So compared with, let's say, with like a multi-signature wallet, like a multi-sig, what is the difference between the second type of signature and like a multi-sig setup?
Oh,
Because
excellent.
yeah.
So a multi-sig is an example of an accountable threshold signature. Yeah.
Oh, I
In an
see. Okay.
inefficient version, it's an inefficient example of an accountable threshold
Mhm.
signature. So multi-sig is basically where, you have like five out of eight need to sign, and the signature basically is the five signatures by the five signers. So the signature reveals the threshold five, and it reveals who signed. Yeah. But if you
Right.
think about a multi-sig, the size of the public key, first of all, is linear in the number of signers. And the size
Okay,
of the
I see.
signature is linear in the number of signers, and the
Okay.
time to verify is linear in the number of signers, right?
Okay.
What accountable threshold signatures allow us to do more generally is to have exactly the properties of a multisig, but do it in a way where the public key is constant size, the signature is constant size or almost constant size, and the time to verify is constant size. Of course, the
Okay.
signature itself has to identify the set of parties that participated, so it can't quite be constant size. It has to at least contain n bits but
Yeah.
it doesn't contain n signatures. It just contains n
Oh,
bits.
okay. That makes
It's
sense.
much
Okay.
more compressed. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's
Yeah,
really
so there's a whole
cool.
area of cryptography which
Yeah.
has kind of been not as widely deployed in the blockchain space, where we do accountable threshold signatures. That is actually what's needed in financial applications. What you described as a multisig is what we would call the trivial accountable threshold signature. Yeah,
Okay.
but there are
That
much
makes sense.
better accountable threshold signatures out there.
Sounds good.
So
Yeah.
one thing that I wanted to mention before we dive into trader tracing
Mhm.
is this question of proactive refresh. Yeah, so this is something, maybe it's a different topic, maybe that's a topic for a different day, but I do want to mention what a proactive refresh is just briefly because it is an important concept. When you do threshold signatures or threshold decryption, what you'd like to do is actually say once an hour, you'd like to run a protocol among all the participants that refreshes all of their secret keys without
Oh.
changing the public key. Yeah, it's crucial without changing the public key. So
Mhm.
you update everybody's secret keys, but the public key stays the same. Yeah.
Okay,
Why
I
do you want to
see.
do that? The reason you want to do that is because if an adversary breaks into one user today and breaks into another user tomorrow, well, the shares have already been refreshed. So those two shares, in some sense, are not compatible with one another anymore. So it
Okay.
doesn't help the adversary recover the key. So what proactive refresh, like an hourly proactive refresh, what it does is it makes it so not only the adversary has to break into 5 out of 8 servers, it has to do it all within 1 hour. Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the refresh will happen and the shares won't match anymore. Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, so a
That's
proactive refresh is a very important thing that needs to be done in the context of protecting keys. We see some companies actually in the blockchain space do proactive refresh.
mhm,
But what's interesting is I'll tell you, even for accountable threshold signatures like a multisig,
mhm.
proactive refresh is non-trivial. Yeah, because
Okay.
remember, your share identifies who signed. So
Yeah.
if you start changing the shares, it's no longer clear how you bind the share to the identity that signed.
Oh, I see. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
And in fact, a multisig is provable. It's not possible to do a proactive refresh on a multisig. That is
Oh,
provable.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
well, one of the things that we did actually, this is in a paper from last year, is we showed how to do proactive refresh even for an accountable threshold signature. Yeah. So
Mhm,
you can refresh the shares without changing the public key.
mhm.
Yeah. So once an hour, you refresh everybody's shares,
Oh,
the
wow.
public key doesn't change. Yeah.
Oh,
So
that's
it's
super
important. I think
cool.
it's important for the folks in the blockchain space to know that this is possible.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like, like session cookies refreshing so often, every time you refresh the page. That's really
Exactly.
cool. Yeah.
Exactly. And it was
So,
not possible to do before. Now it is
yeah.
possible.
Okay. Yeah. So moving towards
Yeah.
the trader chasing paper, can you kind of provide us with an overview of how like the proposed tracing algorithm works? Does it identify members of a misbehaving quorum? And what are kind of the guarantees that this new
Yes.
solution provides?
Great. Let's do that. Let's do that. So, right. So just like we have accountability in the context of threshold signatures,
Mhm.
we'd also like to have accountability in the context of threshold decryption. Okay, so what does that
Right.
mean? What does that mean? So first of all, why do we need threshold decryption? Well, threshold decryption in the context of blockchains is now starting to get used for the purposes of encrypted mempools, right? So if I'm an L2 and I run an encrypted mempool, then or maybe even if I'm an L1 and I run an encrypted mempool, people
Right.
can submit encrypted transactions to me, yeah, and then, or rather, submit encrypted transactions to the mempool. And the idea is that as the validators sign those signed blocks, they also reveal decryption shares. And so the
Okay.
minute there are enough signature shares to finalize the block, there will also be enough decryption shares to decrypt the block. Yeah. And so the purpose of threshold signatures, threshold decryption in this case, is to make sure that it is not possible to decrypt the block before it is finalized. Yeah, it's
Okay.
only possible to decrypt the block once enough validators release their decryption share. Yeah.
Okay.
And there are other applications of threshold decryptions like that outside of the blockchain space. For example, in an auctions protocol, maybe I submit an encrypted bid to the auction. And the reason we want to use threshold decryption is we want to make sure all those decryption bids are decrypted only once the auction is closed, only once
Yeah.
the auction is over. Yeah, they're not decrypted before the auction is over, so somebody can't outbid me just because they saw what my bid is. Yeah, so The purpose of threshold decryption is to prevent premature decryption. Yeah, just like in the case of a mempool, we want to prevent premature decryption of a transaction, so it's harder to sandwich it. Same thing with auctions, same thing with voting. There are voting systems where I would submit encrypted votes. The reason we want to thresholdize the decryption key is to make sure that the encrypted votes are only decrypted after the election is over, and only the tally is decrypted, not the individual.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so that's what
Yeah.
we use. So we kind of use threshold decryption to make sure that only the right things are decrypted and only at the right time. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now
Yeah.
the problem with this is threshold decryption is kind of a 30-year-old concept. Yeah. It's an old concept. The amazing thing is that kind of nobody paid attention to accountability because it wasn't needed until the blockchain space came along. Yeah. So kind of blockchain space is creating these new problems in cryptography, new research problems in cryptography, which is terrific. There's a lot of work for cryptographers to do in the blockchain space because of this. Yeah. So what's the problem? The problem is that let's talk about the example of an encrypted mempool, although the same exact example would apply to encrypted auctions and encrypted votes. The problem is, let's say I'm a searcher and I want to look at transactions before they are finalized. Yeah, maybe the searcher wants to sandwich transactions or so. So they want to look at transactions before they are finalized. What the searcher can do is it can go to the validators and say, hey, Mr. Validator, I'll pay you $100 if you sell me your decryption share. Okay. Let's say the validator says, sure, here's my decryption key. Yeah. And if the adversary can buy enough decryption keys, then once it exceeds the threshold, it can go then and decrypt at home any transaction that it wants.
Right.
Yeah. And then basically it can do its sandwich attacks and so on. So we kind of nullify the whole point of encrypted mempools, because now the adversary can decrypt transactions prematurely. It's just the public can't do it. So we've just created kind of an asymmetry between the searcher and the public, which one could argue is even worse than having everything in the clear. Okay, so why is this possible in threshold decryption today? The problem is that today, if a threshold of parties get together, they can actually reconstruct the master's decryption key. And this master decryption key is the same for all parties. It doesn't reveal which set of parties reveal their decryption shares. So today, the set of misbehaving parties can sell enough decryption shares so that they cannot be traced. Yeah, because the information they reveal has nothing to do with their identities. Yeah, again, what they would sell is the global decryption key. Yeah, and the global decryption key doesn't reveal who they are. Even worse, if they wanted to, once there are a threshold of misbehaving parties, they can actually rederive everybody else's decryption shares. So they can make it look like an innocent party is the one who sold its shares, even though the innocent party didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, so that's pretty bad, right? That's kind of the situation in the existing threshold decryption systems.
That
So
makes
that's what we'd
sense.
like to prevent.
Okay.
Yeah, make sense?
So yeah, so in that sense, then so a success case here is that like you just find a single and collaborator and then you slash them. But is that actually enough to guarantee economic security? So what if like the reward from all T agents collaborating is greater than the stake of any single identified staker? That would still incentivize them.
You're jumping a step. So
okay.
let me just slow us down just a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
So what is the goal of traitor tracing for threshold decryption? The point is, if you have a set of parties that come together and create what we call a decryption algorithm, so it can take a ciphertext as input and output the corresponding plaintext. If you can create a decryption algorithm, then there is a tracing algorithm that will go ahead and interact with this decryption algorithm, figure out who created that decryption algorithm, and then slash them. Yeah, today with existing, this is important to understand. Today with existing threshold decryption system, it is not possible to build such a tracing algorithm.
Oh, I see.
What we'd like to do is we'd like to have threshold decryption systems where this is possible. Now let's go back to your question, Jay. So you're asking the age-old question, right?
Yeah.
So if the slashing amount is less than the reward you would get from misbehavior, what is the point of slashing?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's, I would say, that is a bigger question than just what we're discussing here. That would also apply in proof of stake systems, right?
Right.
If in proof of stake systems, if the reward from double signing a block are greater than the slashing penalties from double signing a block, then what's to prevent you from double signing? Yeah.
Oh, I
Yeah,
see.
I would say this is not a new question. This is kind of a standard question in this area. And
Yeah.
for that, we just use economic security, right? So if
Okay.
if we have 600,000 people need to get together in order to double sign a block, then the slashing cost would be 600,000 times 32 ETH. Yeah, which is a
Okay.
huge amount. So now you would need to have a transaction that's worth so much that it's more than 600,000 times 32 ETH, right? So the answer is
Yeah.
basically slashing provides economic security, and therefore the hope is that that discourages that kind of misbehavior.
Cool. Sounds
Yeah.
good.
There is one more question in terms of incentives that we should talk about. Imagine the searcher buys a decryption algorithm from a bunch of validators. And the problem is the searcher could just keep the decryption algorithm to itself. So then, as a result, we will never be able to trace and slash those validators, those misbehaving validators. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So the question is, what was the point of tracing? If the decryption algorithm doesn't become public, what is
Yeah.
the point of tracing those validators? And the answer to that is, in some sense, the validators, the minute they sell the decryption algorithm to the searcher now has a lot of power over them because it could threaten to say, hey, I'm going to publish this decryption algorithm that you gave me and cause you guys to be slashed unless you pay me, so much more, right?
Yeah.
More generally, I would say just the fear that they could be traced for misbehavior would actually already encourage the validators from not selling a decryption algorithm. Yeah, so
Oh,
just
okay.
the possibility of tracing already acts as a deterrence to not misbehave. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
whether you actually get traced or not is kind of besides the point. The risk of tracing is hopefully already enough to discourage you from selling your decryption key.
Oh, okay. So it's kind of like a threat recourse that like I can do this. I don't want to, but I can do this.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Or
Yeah.
potentially by giving away your decryption key, you might be traced and then slashed, and that would
Oh,
discourage you
okay.
from giving away your decryption key in the first place, even though you might actually never get traced. Just the mere possibility is already introducing risk
Okay.
that would discourage you from selling your decryption key.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, cool. Yavor, do you want to take it on the more technical questions?
Absolutely, it would be my pleasure. So, the first question I was curious about was about how you would identify faulty parties within this traitor tracing algorithm. In particular, you define a notion of a good trace and a bad trace in definition 3 of your paper. And I was curious as to why you require a strict definition that the subset of identified parties is a strict subset of the traitorous parties, in that J prime is a strict subset of J, i.e. there are no false positives, rather than there has been at least one traitorous party that has been properly identified, namely that the union of J prime, the set of parties that have been identified, with the true set of traitorous parties is not the empty subset, so that there is at least one true positive. If, for example, we have 10 true positives but one false positive, why would this not qualify as a good trace?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's quite a long question. Let's see. Let's take
Yeah.
this in parts. Right. So first of all, the searcher is going to go to the validators and is going to talk to a bunch of validators and say, hey, sell me a decryption algorithm. These validators might work together. They put together their decryption keys and they sell the searcher a decryption algorithm. So the first thing we have to do is define what is a valid decryption algorithm. Yeah. Right. This is what we call a good box versus a bad box. So what is a decryption algorithm? Valid decryption algorithm. And so a valid decryption algorithm is one that if you feed in a ciphertext into the decryption algorithm, it outputs the correct plaintext with some non-negligible probability. It doesn't always have to work. Yeah, maybe you feed it a ciphertext and it decides not to work. But you can, for most ciphertext or for many ciphertext that you feed into it, it will output the correct plaintext, as we said, with non-negligible probability. Okay, that's the decryption algorithm that we want to trace. So then our tracing algorithm, what it does is you could say, well, maybe the tracing algorithm should look inside of the decryption algorithm and try to figure out which decryption keys are embedded in it, so that that would tell you which parties misbehaved. Turns out that's a really bad idea, because the decryption algorithm doesn't actually have to list the decryption keys in plain text, right? It might obfuscate them in some way. So by looking at the code of the decryption algorithm, you might never be able to figure out which parties actually misbehaved. Instead, what we'd like to do is we'd like the tracing algorithm to interact with the decryption algorithm as a black box. Yeah, it just feeds in ciphertexts, looks at how they're decrypted, and based on the responses, it's able to figure out who the misbehaving parties are. Yeah, so the decryption algorithm, we treat it strictly as a black box. Okay, so then, so just to give a little bit of intuition as to how this works, what we do is we feed into the decryption algorithm, the tracer will feed invalid ciphertexts. Yeah. And it so happens that if the decryption algorithm has one subset of decryption keys and not a different subset, then in some cases it will fail to decrypt an invalid ciphertext, and in other cases it will succeed in decrypting an invalid ciphertext. And so what we do is we feed it these invalid ciphertexts, and we look to see when does it fail to decrypt and when does it succeed to decrypt. And based on when it fails and when it succeeds, we are able to figure out exactly who, or at least we're able to capture one of the members that created this decryption algorithm, at least one of the members. Okay, so now back to your question, Yavor. You're asking, like, what does it mean for the tracing algorithm to output a valid trace? So the thing that we're most worried about, actually, there's two things we're worried about. The thing that we're most worried about is that the tracing algorithm might end up accusing an innocent party. Yeah. So someone who did not create the decryption algorithm. Yeah. That would be terrible, right? So we don't want to accuse innocent parties. And that is this condition that you were saying: the tracing algorithm outputs a set J prime, and J prime has to be a subset of the set J that created the decryption algorithm. If J prime were not a subset of the set J, that would mean that at least one party in J prime, the set that's pronounced guilty, is actually innocent. Yeah, if J prime were not a subset of J, at least one member of J prime must be innocent, because it's not one of the participants who created the decryption algorithm. Yeah, so that's one thing we're worried about. The tracing algorithm should never accuse an innocent party. In other words, output of the tracing algorithm, J prime should always be a subset of the set J. Okay? The other problem we're worried about is the tracing algorithm might give up. Yeah, what does it mean for it to give up? It might say, hey, I don't know who to blame, so I'm just going to output the empty set as the guilty coalition. Yeah, the guilty set. Yeah. Well, so sure, if the tracing algorithm outputs the empty set, we are certainly no innocent party will be blamed, but that's not a valid trace either, right? So the other thing we want to make sure, exactly. So the other thing we want to make sure is that the tracing algorithm never outputs an empty set. Yeah. So there are two requirements. One is J prime is contained in J, and the other one is J prime is not empty. Yeah. So an innocent party doesn't get blamed, but at least one party does get blamed. Yeah, that's kind of the requirement for tracing.
I see. No, that's exceptionally reasonable, and that makes a lot more sense that it's clarified now. So I have another question that's related to the bipart threshold encryption BTKEM thing, conception that you introduced in section 4 in your solution, where each party holds two distinct keys and therefore creates two different ciphertexts. Can you explain at a high level how this BTKEM mechanism works and why it's necessary for this construction for traitor tracing in particular?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So let's see. So, right. So traitor tracing for threshold decryption, it turns out this is a new concept that's introduced in the paper. I think it's a really interesting concept, and I think there's a lot more to study about traitor tracing for threshold decryption. So let's see. we were basically, as I said, existing threshold decryption systems do not provide tracing abilities. Yeah, there's a way for colluding parties to create a decryption algorithm that cannot be traced. So the question is, how do we build a threshold decryption system that supports this tracing property? If a threshold of parties creates a decryption algorithm, we can always trace it to at least one member of the set that created the algorithm. Yeah. So the way we do that is by leveraging an existing cryptographic concept, which is called traitor tracing. Yeah, so traitor tracing, again, it's an old concept in cryptography. It's got nothing to do with threshold crypto. Interestingly, it comes from the world of well, maybe you guys remember the world of CDs and DVDs. Yeah, where DVDs were encrypted, the movies on a DVD was encrypted in such a way that every DVD player had a different key on it that's able to decrypt the DVD movie. Okay, and the idea then there is if somebody is able to break into a bunch of DVD players and extract their keys, they then build what we call a pirate DVD player. Yeah, that's just able to decrypt any movie at once. It should be possible to trace the pirate player to the set of DVD players that was compromised. Yeah, and then we'd like to basically revoke those DVD players. So future movies will be encrypted in such a way that those DVD players cannot decrypt, and therefore the pirate player cannot decrypt either. Yeah. So traditional traitor tracing has no threshold mechanism in it. Yeah, the traditional traitor tracing, every single user can decrypt on their own. Yeah. What we'd like to do is basically we'd like to kind of elevate the concept of traitor tracing to threshold traitor tracing, where we don't just trace decryption boxes they can decrypt on their own, but we trace like decryption boxes that were created by a threshold of parties in a threshold decryption setting. Yeah, it's a kind of a different, it's quite a different concept than traditional traitor tracing, and that's what we set out to build in this paper. Okay, so that actually introduces a really interesting research question where I think there's a ton more work to do. Yeah, take existing traitor tracing systems which don't have a threshold property, right? Again, in a traitor tracing system, every party can decrypt on its own. You don't need a set of parties to participate in order to decrypt. Every party can decrypt on their own. So take all sorts of existing systems for traitor tracing and try to introduce a threshold mechanism into them. Yeah, I think that's kind of a beautiful research question. There's still a lot more to do. What we did in our paper is basically we looked at a very specific traitor tracing system. It's called the BN08 traitor tracing. BN stands for Boneh. Yeah. And so the BN08 traitor tracing system was particularly interesting for the blockchain space because it has properties that are useful in the blockchain space. So let me tell you what those properties are. First of all, the public key size is constant size. Yeah, it doesn't matter how many parties you have, the public key size is always constant size. More importantly, the ciphertext is constant size. Yeah, it's this four group elements. That's it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
really
that's
small.
really,
Wow.
yeah, exactly. So that's really important in the context of an encrypted mempool. When you post your encrypted ciphertext, it's just four group elements as a header. So you get constant size ciphertext. Decryption time is also constant. Yeah, so decrypting basically is really fast. The only downside of that system is that the secret keys are large. Yeah, so for example, in the context of Cosmos, where you might have like 100 or 200 validators, each validator would have to store a secret key that's about 100 megabytes.
Wow.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot, but a validator is a big machine, right? A validator is an organization, so storing 100 megabytes in the context of Cosmos maybe is not such a big deal. Yeah, so the nice thing about that system is kind of it's a very simple system to implement, and it has kind of all the right properties, right? Everything that goes on chain is constant size, and the only thing that's large is the secret key, but that's something that the validators keep on their own, and they can certainly do that because they have the resources to do it. So that's why we wanted to make that system into a threshold system. And now it's not at all obvious. That system, I don't think we want to go into the details of how that system works. It uses these things called fingerprinting codes, which are kind of cool objects on their own. But it turns out making that system into a threshold system is non-trivial. Yeah, it requires kind of new cryptographic concepts. And that's actually what we built in the paper. So the BT-chem mechanism that you described is basically the cryptographic crutch that's needed to take the BN traitor tracing system and make it into a threshold traitor tracing traitor tracing for threshold decryption system. Yeah. So we can go into the details of the BT-chem. I'll tell you that we give several constructions for these BT-chems, and the best one is basically the best one that we give basically has these constant size public keys, constant size ciphertext, and constant size decryption time, constant time decryption time. Yeah, and so that it kind of has all the kind of the nice properties you want for a blockchain. And yes, it has a large secret key, but perhaps that's acceptable in this setting. Yeah, so hopefully that's kind of clear. Now, what I should say is that really there's a huge design space here. Yeah, over the years, there are dozens of traitor tracing systems that have been developed. Yeah. And the question is, what does it take to sort of elevate each one of those systems into a threshold system? And you can see elevating the BN system took like new cryptographic ideas. So elevating other traitor tracing systems to make them threshold would also take new cryptographic ideas. So in the paper, we actually we elevate another system into a threshold traitor tracing scheme, but that system is a bit more theoretical. So it would be interesting. I should say, for example, Mark Zandri, just like a couple of months ago in 2024, posted a very interesting traitor tracing system for bilinear maps. Also has very good properties. It would be very interesting to add a threshold traitor tracing mechanism to that system. Yeah, these are open research questions that anyone can work on. So yeah, there's a wide field here. And as we said, all these systems are kind of needed for protecting encrypted mempools. And so, not only is this interesting research, it's also research that is directly applicable to the blockchain space.
That's really interesting. Speaking of bilinear maps, it seems that there were within the algorithm that was presented in traitor tracing, there was the use of elliptic curve pairings or just pairings in general, and the discrete log assumption. But this is a little bit of a departure of the previous topic, but my question is, do you think this algorithm will be safe in a post-quantum future? And do you think this can be adapted so that it can be made safe in a post-quantum future? Do you think this idea of traitor tracing in general can be made post-quantum, or does it rely on specific cryptographic primitives? Or
yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the answer is no. In a post-quantum world, this will not be secured. Any system based on discrete log is not going to be secure in a post-quantum world. But we don't live in a post-quantum world. Yeah, it's going to take still a long time before we have quantum machines that can break these systems. At least that's a hypothesis. We hope it's going to take a long time, because if it doesn't, then there are many other elements of the blockchain that would be in trouble. In particular, ECDSA is not secure in Schnorr signatures are not secure in a post-quantum world. So yeah, post-quantum, there are many aspects of the blockchain that would need to change, but we're not there yet. Yeah, eventually maybe, but we're not there yet. So yeah, so what you ask is a really, really good question, because again, it opens up a quite a beautiful research problem, which is to say, can we build traceable threshold decryption systems from post-quantum assumptions, like lattices, for example? So I can tell you that we have traitor tracing systems, non-threshold traitor tracing systems from lattices. The question is, can we adapt those to support threshold traitor tracing? Yeah, so we can do traitor tracing on threshold decryption systems. Right now, that's an open problem. We haven't worked on it. I think it's a wonderful direction for further research. The more power to you. So for those listening, please work on this, because that would be an important problem to solve. The world we would like to get to is a world where for every primitive that we use on the blockchain, we have a post-quantum variant. Yeah. I think that's actually quite an important vision, so that, if we're surprised and maybe in 20 years somebody builds a quantum computer that can break these systems, the blockchain can quickly switch to these post-quantum primitives and remain secure. Yeah, so the vision is for every primitive that we use in the blockchain, we'd like to have a post-quantum variant that we can switch to if we need to. Yeah, so since we're proposing traceable threshold decryption systems for the blockchain, we should have a post-quantum version of that as well. And so, yeah, I would totally be thrilled if somebody developed that and wrote a paper on it. I think it'll be a really nice paper.
That sounds super
Absolutely,
cool.
that sounds really exciting. I'll hand it over to Jay. He has some additional questions for blockchain applications and future work, but this was extraordinarily interesting from a cryptographic perspective. So
Great.
yeah.
Excellent. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So I guess one of my questions, in terms of its application to blockchain its applications in the blockchain space is that you talked a lot about like addressing encrypted mempools and like MEV concerns there. So outside of that, what might be some of the real world projects today that would benefit from this traitor tracing system, and how would they kind of benefit from these new cryptographic primitives that you introduced in the paper?
Oh yeah. Look, I mean, so there are already a number of blockchains out there that use an encrypted mempool, right? I guess Osmosis is a very well-known one. What is it? There's another one called Shutter Network that uses encrypted mempool. So there's a couple of those. There's a couple that have put it on their roadmap. So we're going to see encrypted mempools in wider and wider use, probably in the near future. Yeah. Why actually? Maybe one thing to clarify is, why is an encrypted mempool a good idea? So today, of course, when you submit transactions to the mempool, they're all available. Transactions are available in the clear. So there's lots of MEV opportunities to sandwich those transactions and so on, right? The hope is that if we encrypt the transactions, so the transactions are only decrypted once the block is finalized, then that would make MEV extraction somewhat harder. I should stress, by the way, that MEV extraction is not impossible. So encrypted mempools don't fully prevent MEV. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They just make it harder to exploit, so there is some protection to end users. Yeah, it seems like it's a fairly sort of low-hanging fruit that we might as well do. It's not that hard, at least in theory, to do an encrypted mempool. In practice, actually, there are all sorts of complications with doing an encrypted mempool. But in principle, at least, it's conceptually not that difficult to kind of understand what an encrypted mempool would look like. And since it does provide some protection against MEV, it seems like a reasonable direction to go. By the way, maybe I should say that one of the difficulties in providing an encrypted mempool is now when you build blocks, you don't actually know how much gas the transactions are going to take. Yeah, because transactions are encrypted, and typically, until you execute a transaction, you don't actually know how much gas it's going to take. Yeah, well, if you can't see the transaction, you can't execute it, and as a result, you don't know how much gas it will take. So maybe encrypted transactions can have an upper bound in the amount of gas attached to them, and then you can assemble blocks based on the maximum amount of gas that it will consume. But that would introduce some inefficiency, because that, of course, is imprecise. Yeah,
of course.
So that's one issue with encrypted mempools. There are a couple of other practical issues with encrypted mempools, but by and large, I think we have fairly good answers to all of those issues, and we see that actually this has been deployed, Osmosis, Shutter, and so on. So we can actually get to the point where encrypted mempools are out there, and transactions will only become available in the clear once the block is finalized. That's kind of, I think, reasonable goal to strive for.
And another question would be like, what do kind of like the on-chain computational storage burdens for like the threshold decryption, like traitor tracing algorithm look like if we were to deploy this in like a blockchain setting? And how do these costs kind of compare to a regular T out of N threshold decryption scheme?
Sorry, you're talking about the on-chain costs?
Yeah, like the on-chain costs, yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, that's specific to the encryption system we use. So, like I was saying, with our encryption system, ciphertexts are constant size, or rather, I should say, the ciphertext header is constant size. So today, you could use a standard encryption system like El-Gamal, or something derived from El-Gamal like ECIES, which is provides also chosen ciphertext security, which is important in these settings. What we're saying is, instead of using these standard systems, which are provably not traceable, use a traceable scheme like ours. What we do, the cost would be that instead of having like 1 or 2 group elements in the ciphertext, we would have to have 4 group elements in the ciphertext. And so there is a little bit of cost, but it's not too bad, right? I mean, each group element is, maybe a couple of dozen bytes. So, we'd add a few dozen bytes to the ciphertext, which is not so bad, and as a result, you would have traceability available to you. I think
That's
that
really
so the
cool.
on-chain cost, I think, is completely manageable. The
Mhm.
question is whether validators are okay with keeping these 100 megabyte keys. Yeah, so a key
Oh,
is
okay.
large, and we have to make sure that the validators are okay storing those keys.
So are those 100 megabyte keys like they're just
Secret keys.
part of all of
Secret keys.
the are they just part of this system or are they part of also like other encrypted mempool
No,
systems?
no. Sorry. Encrypted mempools today are not
Yeah.
traceable.
Oh,
So
okay.
in
Right.
encrypted mempools today, secret keys are constant size. Yeah, they just
Oh, okay.
invariant log
Okay.
them out.
Okay, I see.
What we're saying is let's move to a traceable decryption system. In our scheme, that would require large secret keys stored at the validator. There could
Oh,
be
okay.
other traceable encryption systems that maybe don't have such large secret keys. Often, I can tell you
Okay.
there's a trade-off between the size of the secret key and the size of the ciphertext. Like you
Oh,
can make
okay.
the ciphertext larger, and as a result, the secret keys become much smaller. But of course, if you make the ciphertext larger, now there's more storage required on chain because ciphertexts go on chain. Yeah. And
Okay.
so, yeah, potentially, yes. And so, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to design here. And so, in addition to just designing the crypto system, there's also a lot of work to designing exactly how the blockchain would use it.
Okay, sounds good. And yeah, so I guess my final question is, what do you think might be some of the directions for like future research in this space, especially for like an aspiring researcher like our listeners today?
Oh my God, yeah, I think there's a ton of research work to do. Yeah, I think I mentioned like a cool area for research is to take other trader tracing systems and make them support threshold decryption. Yes.
Mm,
Um, I think Yavor's question about quantum resistance is a really good one. There are quantum resistant trader tracing systems. The question is, can we use those to make quantum resistant trader tracing systems that support threshold decryption? Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's a really interesting one. There are lots of, like I said, I think I mentioned Mark Zandri has this new bilinear based trader tracing system. It would be really interesting to make that into a threshold
Mhm.
decryption system that's traceable. So yeah, so all those questions would be wonderful to resolve. They would be applicable in the blockchain space. I think they will be applicable in encrypted auction systems. They would be applicable in encrypted voting systems and so on. So they would have applications even beyond the blockchain.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sounds super cool. Thank you, Dan, so much for joining us today. Yeah,
Yeah, this is great. Lots of fun. Thank you, Jay.
yeah,
Thank you,
for
everyone.
sure.